hi, everyone who's watching on the video. We're just doing a quick intro here. One of the things that we have observed over the last couple of years is that a lot of volunteers from USDR end up saying, I really like doing this work, and transitioning more full-time into the broader civic tech or public interest tech landscape. And so in this panel at the end of the year, we thought it was a great time to really surface and highlight some of the folks who have done that. And so we're really gonna, this is gonna be all about what it's like to transition from civic tech, what's different, how it's similar, how you can use your skills in the public interest. And so we're going to hear from three panelists who've all been former USDR volunteers who are now working full-time in the space. We have first Aditya Sridhar, who is a software engineer here at USDR, and formerly was a software engineer at Czech and a few other tech companies, and was also a USDR volunteer with back, I think, in 2020 in New York City. Second, we have Dave Cole, who is now a tech lead at the Office of Innovation and Strategy with the state of New Jersey, was formerly the VP of Strategy and Operations at Mapbox, and also a former USDR volunteer working on our government's team. And then last, but certainly not least, Nadine Levin, who is the head of user research, or head of research at the San Francisco Digital Service, and was formerly a staff UX researcher at Facebook, and also a USDR volunteer. So I'm really excited for them to get to share their stories with everyone here. We really enjoy questions from everyone in the audience. So please get your mind thinking about what you'd like to learn from our panelists, and just drop that into the Zoom chat. I have some questions for them, and we'll kind of kick things off, and then I'll open it up for anyone who has specific questions that they want to learn more about. So with that, I think we have kind of covered the intros. We're going to talk a lot about joining civic tech and what it's like. So let's dive in. So just for all of the panelists, would love to kick things off. How did you originally get into civic tech? What drew you in, and what has kept you here? And here's my civic tech cat. All right, Aditya, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Yeah. Hey, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Yeah, my interest into civic tech, I think, primarily started from working with the New York City Mayor's office in 2020. I think as a software engineer, I've been in the private sector my whole career, and didn't really find a good opening. And especially during the pandemic, I felt like, what am I even contributing, right? Everyone is getting into an emergency, and I felt like I was not being very useful. So found USDR, started volunteering with the mayor's office, and then finally found a good role that was more full-time and permanent earlier this year. Nadine, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think my journey into civic tech was related to a lot of the work that I ended up doing at Facebook. I still call it Facebook, so I'm not going to use the word meta just by reflex. Was with populations that tech companies don't typically prioritize, or they prioritize less. So older adults, people with lower digital skills. And it was sometimes a struggle to get companies to consider those populations, because for a variety of reasons that we can go into later. But at the same time as I was doing that research, I was also similarly kind of like sitting in my office in the pandemic, thinking about how lucky I was to have a job, and how a lot of government institutions were struggling to support the population. And then kind of magically, I stumbled upon this field that seemed to take accessibility and equity as the kind of like cornerstone, rather than as like an afterthought or something that companies do because they have to. And so that was really what pulled me in. And then I also volunteered with USDR and realized that it wasn't actually that different in a lot of ways from what was happening in the private sector. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. I most recently got involved in this work actually coming from the private sector. While working at Mapbox at the time, we were about 500 folks. So we'd grown from a small startup into a pretty big company. Most of my work was actually internationally based, opening up new offices, spending a lot of time, particularly in Asia. So as you all can imagine, in the beginning of 2020, starting with our team in China and then Singapore and Japan, we just were shutting down and moving to remote. So I had about 50% time that I wasn't traveling anymore. Started volunteering with USDR, got to meet Alex way back when the organization was just getting started. And at that point, there was a need to help out with governments in the New Jersey, New York area, which is where I'm from. So I got to work a little bit with some of the teams that had been doing this work inside of the government, contribute some my kind of technical background to those efforts. And a couple months in, eventually just really wanted to do more of it, and there was an opportunity to join full time. So I jumped over to the New Jersey innovation team after that. In the past, I had kind of bounced back and forth, which we can discuss in a bit, between working on campaigns and government, and then the private sector. Most of my time, though, actually has been spent particularly at Mapbox and kind of growing up with that company. So happy to share what that's been like each time. But thanks again for joining.
Terrific. Well, one thing that I should mention is that, and Dave pointed out, Aditya was working in New York City at the same time that Dave was we called them account managers, folks who are really understanding, working with governments to figure out what's the shape of the problems that they had and how could we find volunteers to help. So there's a deep connection there. So, I'm sure a lot of folks are probably wondering, on this call, just how do we even think about civic tech or talk about it? We use the word government. Government seems like a big monolithic thing a lot of times, but it's really not. And so I'd love to kind of open it up, maybe Dave and Nadine, how would you sort of describe civic tech, and maybe give a little bit of the lay of the landscape? What are the different options that are out there, and how that compares to private tech as well?
Yeah, I can start. So yeah, I found it quite confusing and daunting when I was first looking for a job after USDR and like where to begin. And I think after doing a couple informational interviews, what I realized, or the kind of key axes that I now think about it on and that I tell people, is thinking about, first of all, are you looking at being part of a government at the city, the state, or the federal level? So there are distinct, institutions, and they have pros and cons at all of those levels. So city level, I think I get to work really, really closely with residents and people who live in the city, and see the impact of, policy and changes probably a little bit quicker, but the scope is smaller, right? Whereas federal government is maybe I'll let others speak to federal government because I haven't worked in it, but my impression is it's a little bit longer and you're a little bit more distanced. I think another key axis is whether or not you're working in-house or for kind of like a contract or consulting agency. So I am embedded in-house. And so, I'm there for the long term. I have like an indefinite contract until something really terrible happens with the economy. Whereas there are a bunch of other consulting agencies that do great work, like Code for America and Nava and, Ad Hoc. And so, when you're in this more consulting based role, like you have different sets of constraints in terms of how close you can get to the people you are working with and building products for, and also kind of how long you might be on an engagement, or kind of, how much of your time you're able to spend. So I'll just stop there and say those are the two main axes that I think about it as.
Yeah, definitely echo the impact. I mean, for me, just as a quick example, most of my work in New Jersey has actually been focused on COVID kind of recovery and vaccine distribution earlier on. And we had an opportunity to build essentially a search engine for vaccine appointments for residents. We spent about 4 weeks working on it, basically just a big web scraper. And when we launched, we had 900,000 people within the first 2 weeks, and then eventually 4 million people, which is almost 50% of the state population. So, from a startup perspective, that kind of scale, you dream of getting that. You work really hard to kind of grow demand for it. It's immediately available. The flip side of that is you're doing this work in, very much in the public eye, and particularly with something like vaccines, which is at that point in time highly sought after. There's always the kind of sensitivity that you need to have to make sure that what you're providing is available across all communities equitably, that you're particularly making sure that people who have a need are kind of first in line over people who might have access to technology and a little better at navigating websites. So I think that is an example that kind of encapsulates the impact that we can have, the value of the work, and how it might compare. Now, granted, in a big tech scenario, I imagine you have access to that kind of scale more readily. But I think the difference that I have seen here is that the scope of work can be so broad, right? So to launch a project like that, we can really work across dimensions with a bunch of different teams. We're not focused on maybe more of a narrow kind of feature of a larger product. We have a lot more scope and autonomy there. And I would also echo, Nadine, as you said, at the federal level, you have more resources, you can do bigger things, but maybe a little bit more removed from the end kind of user on a day-to-day level. So I think there are certainly benefits and just different trade-offs for each of the levels of getting involved, and obviously a great ecosystem of private sector and nonprofit organizations as well now.
I think one more thing to add, if I can, is from a research and equity perspective, one of the other, just building what you were saying, Dave, one of the other big differences that I've experienced is from a research space is a access to an expectation around much more direct engagement with communities. Like, I don't have a layer of market research firms or recruitment firms that are kind of facilitating a lot of the work. So while that is more, I guess you could call it labor for the people in the organization, it's also, one of the reasons that I came to work in this job is being able to speak to people and have a relationship, although that takes a lot of time and effort to build trust in those spaces. But I guess the reason I wanted to bring it back full circle is, since working at the city, I've also realized that there's a ton of community organizations who I wouldn't have traditionally thought of as being part of the city landscape, but because they receive funding from the city and because they are helping support a lot of the programs and kind of more underserved populations, those can also be an interesting place to look if you're interested in civic tech. So they aren't, government, I guess, technically, but they are so tied with the government that you're probably going to get a lot of access and do interesting things.
It's so interesting to hear you all talking about this in almost the same way that we think about it at USDR. And just want to echo how much we focus across all layers of government, but I find that so much of what where services are being delivered is at that local level, and you get so much closer to some of the problems. That's, I think, really motivating for a lot of the folks who volunteer with us as well. And we do see that the nonprofits that are sort of adjacent to government that are delivering a lot of those services and work with them as well, which is really nice. Oh wow, we're getting a bunch of questions from the chat. I'd love to ask one more just a broad question for the panel, and then we'll dive into some of these questions from chat, which is just love to hear from everyone. What is the project that you're most proud of in your civic tech career so far? Dave, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I will kind of reference the vaccine distribution work again because of the scale, because honestly, it was one of those projects that nobody anticipated could be successful, because getting vaccines was so difficult in the beginning. And I think, at least in our kind of small area that we carved off, we were able to demonstrate the value of being human-centered in our approach. We started with a lot of research and talking with folks who were directly trying to access, observing the problems that they were having, navigating a bunch of different private sector websites and phone systems to try to figure out how we could simplify that. So, and also kind of our two pillars really are human-centered design approach, agile development approach afterwards, of making sure that our first release is going to be something we can get to very quickly, validate assumptions, test feedback into the process again. So we got to demonstrate, I think, both of those at a high level, which has actually helped us be able to tackle bigger problems. Now we are working very closely with our Department of Labor on unemployment insurance modernization. This is a multi-year kind of problem. It's something that has been decades in the making. The systems that we're working with, some of which are set up in the early 80s. So there's a lot of kind of work to do, a lot of institutional knowledge to learn, but the impact that you can have on something like that, again, I think is really unique and critical.
Nadine, do you want to jump in next?
Sure. I was wondering if Aditya has anything, but so I joined my team after the majority of the work related to COVID had been done. So I can't claim anything like notifications around vaccines or testing, but What's been interesting is since like a lot of the work that our team did was really reactive during COVID. So it was kind of like fighting fires, as I imagine a lot of other governments were experiencing or maybe continue to experience. But, you know, in the time since then, we've hired more people and we have a little bit more breathing room. And so one of the projects the design team has been thinking about is, how do you design a city website that better represents the city and the people? And is that even something that is important to people when it comes to a government website? And so I did some research where we spoke to people who lived in different cities. So we focused on a couple different metro areas like New York and Austin and Boston and San Francisco, and asked them kind of like, you know, what do you look for when you come to a government website? How and in what ways is it important that it reflects the city that you live in? And out of that research, we have some really great ideas for how to design the San Francisco website, sf.gov. You know, there were questions around like, what are the trade-offs around having something that's very usability focused, so like just, you know, puts total primacy on people getting things done, and then at the same time is so sterile that it doesn't encourage people to participate and want to be involved with the city. And we know that civic participation is really important and increasingly harder. So I think that was just a really cool project. And I think it's also cool because it shows, you know, you could imagine doing similar work like that strategically at a big tech company. So you can see like the skills that you might have grown in the private sector are immediately transferable to the public sector.
Yeah, I can just chime in. I think one project I'd love to highlight is the work that we're doing here in the grants portfolio at USDR. This is a problem space I had not really thought much about, but as everybody knows, there's a lot of billions and more than $1 trillion that has been allocated from the federal government across various bills to in the grants.gov website. So the fact that there's a lot of municipalities and jurisdictions that are not able to take advantage of this money because of the administrative burden that the reporting requirements are needed for when you accept this money is kind of something that I've been working on lately. So I feel like, as from an equity standpoint, if the government is having some money allocated for people, it should be, you know, anyone should be able to take advantage of it. And I think our grants portfolio is trying to make sure that that equity access is there. And I'd love to be seeing how this portfolio grows over the next year. And if more small governments are able to come to us and say like, hey, your tool is what helped us apply for a grant and receive it and report on it without, you know, requiring to hire like 10 more people to just do the paperwork, I think that would be something I'd be proud of.
Awesome. These are such great projects. Well, we're getting so many wonderful questions from chat. So I want to move to answering some of these. So there were a couple that were themed around how to start getting involved, and a few, including, I want to volunteer. How do I do it? The short answer is we'll post a link in chat with a sign-up form at the end. If you need to go beforehand, we can also drop that in a little bit sooner as well. Another question is, well, I want to volunteer, but I'm not as I don't think I have enough experience. And so I want to actually open it up a little bit to our panel and see what recommendations y'all would have for someone who's just getting started in their career and looking to get involved.
I can jump in on that one. So two to come to mind. There's a great organization called Coding It Forward that has two different fellowships, one focused on state and local placement, another for federal. And our office has worked with them to identify fellows that, you know, it's a paid program. We bring them in to work for a summer with us. And then actually in our case, we ended up hiring the two individuals who participated full-time afterwards. So good kind of opportunity to get a little bit more direct experience working in the government context, build out skills a bit, and then I think generally open up a career path. The other is the US Digital Corps, which is a relatively new program, I think in its second year now at the federal level. It's actually a federally run program. So it's an annual cycle. I think we might have just missed the application cycle for this year, but something to consider for folks who are interested in, again, kind of full-time paid work, but maybe if you're coming from a little bit less experience at the federal level, that's a good one to check out too.
I know Stephanie from previous work, so I feel like I need to jump in now. But yeah, I think like there's a lot of similarities in how you would approach finding a job in the public sector to the private sector if you were making a career change. So, you know, it like starts with networking and job boards. USDR has an awesome job board. I used it a lot. The technologist for public good, I think, also has, maybe in the chat people can post job boards, but you know, like mining job boards. And I think what's important to know is it's a pretty small world, like it's a much smaller field. So if you're able to get to know a few people, they might be able to point you in directions of different resources. I think another two like pro tips that I would give, one of them is that there are different requirements for government resumes than the public sector. So when I went from academia to, you know, the private sector, I basically like axed my entire resume and made it very condensed so that the recruiters and the bots could read it and pull the right information. Going then to government, I had to blow it back up again. And there are guides for how to format this, but you know, people will count hours and they will count years of experience, and all of this is going towards your kind of like pay and equity, but that means that you have to fit these very specific conventions that are different from the private sector. So knowing about that is step number one. I think the other thing is that a lot of the job titles that we might be familiar with from the private sector are not a one-to-one match. With the private sector are not a one-to-one match with the public sector. So getting familiar with the diversity of ways that what you do can be represented in the public sector is a good start. So like research might fall under community engagement, it might fall under innovation, and kind of like getting a sense for the range of things that you could apply to, because you might look and say like, oh, that's not me, but it could be. So that's something that you can also do through networking. But those are the two big things that I've seen.
Yeah, someone else who's made the transition recently from private sector to public sector. Anything you'd want to add there?
Yeah, I think from my experience, mostly comes from volunteering and being part of like communities locally. I think Code for America brigades in your local area is very good. And if you're able to get into some of these Slack channels, almost on a weekly basis, there's like everyone's posting different job boards and events that you can get involved with. So that's definitely something I would recommend. Yeah.
Terrific. All right. Well, we've got another theme of questions that I think is really interesting, which is kind of a couple of folks have asked about this. What were some of the adjustments you had to make coming from the private sector to the public sector? What was either surprising or frustrating? And then just what are some of another question right around the challenges? So I'd love to kind of open up and, you know, what are some of the hard parts?
I think my experience, at least coming into the public sector, again, I've been kind of government adjacent. Obviously, USDR is a nonprofit. We work with our government partners. One thing that I've noticed is that there's a huge appetite for innovation within the government. I feel like all of our partners really want to, you know, use the best tools available and try to implement them. But the challenge there is like kind of the resource constraints. We always think like, oh, government just moves slow or whatever may be the case, but because there are people that want to implement things quickly, the fact that there's not enough software engineers, there's not enough capacity to build out these flows that they might want, I think that seems to be where there's a bottleneck. And if you're deploying software within government, you have to think about accessibility requirements, you have to think about security. And when you have to do all that, we need to really have to ship quality software. So one or two software engineers in a CTO's office is not going to cut it. I think we definitely need that. And maybe Nadine or Dave, I think you might have a different perspective.
Yeah, I think related to what you're saying is not just resourcing, but also one thing I've been thinking a lot about is maturity of organizations and processes. So I think like I'm hypothesizing, but civic tech feels like a much newer space to me in terms of how long it's been around, but also how developed it is in terms of practice than private sector. And so what that means is, you know, basic things like there's a standard way of working for running meetings, or a standard way that PMs might run projects and might write documentation or vision statements. Like all of that is lacking, or, it's not as well defined. And so that means that it can be a little bit more hectic because of the lack of structure and maturity, but that also means you have a bigger opportunity to like shape what is happening on your team if you can bring some of that, and you can have like really immediate impact by helping the team be run better and more efficient. I think the other funny thing that I would say that's very different coming from private to public sector is, at least in the city of San Francisco, as ironic as this is, the complete absence of numbers and metrics. So obviously working at Facebook, like so much of our projects were determined and prioritized by, like what kind of company goals there were around making money or around getting a certain number of users, and on like how well the product was doing and A/B testing, and just none of that exists. And so on the one hand, that's very freeing from a qualitative research perspective, because it means I have a lot more buy-in for the work that I do, even though it doesn't have numbers, which was totally different in my last job. But on the other hand, it makes it really, really hard to see how priorities are determined and to also fit into those priorities. So I find there's a lot more what seems to be kind of arbitrary or political decision making. I'm sure that happens in companies. That wasn't my pay grade, but there just seems that the ways that people make decisions are totally different. It is a different culture. And so getting used to that and starting to think about like, what does it mean to not have numbers be at the backbone of this? And also how do I learn about this or introduce numbers to help kind of make it more mature, has been something that's on my mind.
Maybe just one thing to add, that I think that there's generally a lot more diversity in the types of roles in work like this. I mean, at least coming from a tech company, you could pretty much assume a common knowledge around most modern kind of technology or design principles. Working in the government, and I imagine it's like if you're working in tech in a larger company that's not just a tech company, similar, that's not the case, right? The vast majority of people are focused on either kind of running a program, delivering a service or a benefit, potentially legal or policy considerations, and certainly communications. So in those cases, I think it takes a lot of work to first understand how they do their jobs, empathize with kind of what their constraints or incentives are, and then position the things that we would like to do in a way that can be helpful to them as well. It's often not the case that you can or would really want the top down saying we're going to build something in a different way. But if you can figure out kind of the soft skills of, here's why we work in this way, right? Here's why we talk to users at the beginning. Here's another project in the past where we didn't, and it resulted in this undesirable outcome. So we want to try it this way, right? Kind of frame it in terms of those benefits that can help cut through what might be just kind of a knowledge gap or just different experience in where folks are coming from and the reasons they kind of do the work. So also the other thing just to think about too, in terms of when we talk specifically about technology in government, sometimes government technology is incentivized for not taking risks. And so people might make technical decisions based off of, can I isolate the risk in a given vendor? Will that vendor then be responsible if they don't perform? Does that protect my internal organization making this purchasing decision? And I think that dynamic, which is fairly pervasive, can be one of the biggest impediments to trying to create change or working in a different way. So what I find, my personal work and a lot of the folks on the team that I work with end up doing is try to create space for, carving out a specific, prototype or something we can work on, prove a different methodology, but also just try to keep the drumbeat of, hey, there's a lot of things we can learn from other parts of the government that have taken a different approach, from the private sector, from, kind of leading groups that are thinking about technology development a little bit differently than a more traditional way. So I would say those are some of the challenges too that I've seen.
On the flip side, working in a much smaller city government space, I don't see as much vendor usage because we're building services directly for a lot of the city. So that could be another interesting thing to think about as a compare and contrast. And what are you interested in is do you want a little bit more of a direct involvement in how the technology gets made and deployed in a city, or do you want to be able to look across multiple tech projects at once? There's also one other thing that you were sparking for me, Dave, sorry, which is another key difference for me coming from the private sector, which also has to do with the kind of work that I was doing at Facebook, is there's a lot more of a need to focus and balance the experiences of city or, government staff with residents. So a lot of, let's say, research and design from the private sector for me was like thinking about the end users of an app or an experience. And while that's really important, what we've been learning on our team, and I think this, I'm guessing this holds true, is that by actually focusing first on the experiences of staff and the people in the government, you're going to make the experiences of residents and people who receive those services better. And that's been quite a big shift in my mind. And I think just having more of an experience and expectation around doing organizational research and stakeholder management is different.
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, and that, I don't know, Aditya, if there's anything you want to add to that, but the grants management work that you're working on is all about making that experience better for the people who are managing that process so that the money can then get unblocked. All right, we are getting so many great questions. Let's let's shift gears a little bit. There's a number of questions I think here around just kind of the working within teams, like the size of teams. So for example, a couple folks were asking, what are most of the roles? Are there more sort of manager roles? Are there more individual contributor roles? Maybe talk a little bit about the type of collaboration that's happening there. How for folks who are looking to jump in, what's that actually like?
I think it's going to vary by team. So our team, when I joined, was maybe 15 or so folks, and it's grown to about 25. We are at a point now where we are very seriously kind of considering a little bit more structure, bringing on managers, particularly those with professional kind of people management expertise and backgrounds. So up until this point, like I think any small organization, folks have kind of grown into those roles organically, but it's something we're being more deliberate. But I mean, I don't know if other panelists have direct experience with this, but I know of, particularly in the federal government, teams that are larger that do hire directly for managers or what they call supervisory roles. It just really, I think, depends on kind of the maturity of the team and where they're at.
Yeah, I think I can't speak to other places, but I think two things really, like I think what Dave was hinting at is like, I think there's a difference between coming into a role and knowing you're an IC versus sussing out the potential for growth of that organization and what that means for your role as it evolves. So, if you come in and you know that the organization is about to receive money and it's going to double its headcount, that means there's probably an opportunity to, once you've been there, negotiate the kind of work in that role that you do, or the organization is going to need to hire for more of these like management roles eventually. I think the other thing that I have realized is that although I am an IC in my current role, a lot of what I do is mentorship and traditional project management because I have to wear a lot of hats. So, I don't technically have a manager title, but because I am helping teach other people how to do research in the organization, because I'm helping run projects, I actually think I have like the best of both worlds, where I don't have to do a lot of the management type activities that made me run away from it at Facebook, but I get to, do a lot of the coaching and strategic thinking that I think is what I prefer. And then the other thing is maybe a myth to dispel that there are no promotions in government. I have seen people on my team be rewarded for their hard work and promoted. And so I think that's another thing to think about or ask about when you're interviewing is like, has anyone been promoted for their work, or whatever the career pathways that you can see?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, from a USDR standpoint, we have IC roles and lead roles, all are available. I think there's a pathway for multiple type of careers over here. At least that's what I've seen on our side, and I'm sure that that's true of government, like Nathan and Cole mentioned.
Nathan, thanks so much for touching on the mentorship piece. We did have a question about that was a little bit more general, which is, are there norms or mechanisms more broadly in the public sector for mentorship and professional development? so, I mean, I think you kind of answered that. The second part of the question, which is there capacity to mentor? Clearly, some cases, yes. But I'm curious if you have anything, if there's any more broad systems or mechanisms you'd want to share.
Yeah, this is a hard one. I think it touches on the maturity piece that I was talking about, where, even something what I would consider as basic as a network of UX researchers in civic tech is not super well defined. And so without those basic building blocks, like, the other people in your field, especially if you work, for a while, I was a team of one. And so mentorship becomes really tough when I'm the only person in my organization doing what I'm doing. And so to get mentorship, I need to go find a community, and that community still needs to be built or is being slowly built. I think like organizations like Code for America that have been around for longer, that are larger, have that community, but for me, it didn't exist. I think that the other, so I think, there was one thing that we were going to talk about, which is like, how do you get involved in this if you're less experienced, which is, I think, the mentoring question. And I think that would be like, I think there's a reality where, at least from my perspective, working in government without a lot of the kind of like soft skills that you would have built by working in other big organizations, whether or not that's public or private or tech, I think is pretty tough, because it's pretty messy. You have to have good stakeholder management skills. You have to be willing to deal with ambiguous environments. But I think this mentoring piece is kind of like the key to succeeding. So if you are thinking about taking on a role where you're on your own, like finding someone and reaching out to them, I think is key, or identifying people within your organization that will help you grow. But I don't have the answers to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons sometimes people really like USDR as an organization is it's a place to get some external input. We like to be that first call when something comes up, if there isn't necessarily someone out there, kind of in their local government. There's also a lot of sort of at the sort of state level often, or kind of associations, county associations across the state, and then within different particular disciplines, often sort of like national organizations, or like NASCIO, like the National Association of State CIOs. So there are a lot of different membership organizations like that are out there as well to support people. All right. So there was a question that I think is really worth touching on. It's sometimes people don't like to talk about it as much, but I was wondering, especially for folks who've served in government, let's talk about pay for a minute. How do pay structures work in government jobs? And I think tell us a little bit more about how we should think about that.
I can jump in on that. So the federal pay schedule is completely public. Most state pay schedules are. I think probably all public sector ones are. So you can get a feel for exactly what the bands are. I think the challenge is often figuring out how do my individual skills kind of map to a certain band so I can understand what I might get paid. Usually in public sector positions, I think the salary is public. I know at all federal levels, it's actually disclosed what the pay band would be. States are case by case. At least on our team, we try to be proactive in listing that. I would say that maybe holistically salaries are a little bit lower, but I do think that there's a lot of nuance that goes into that. And I'd be surprised for most folks kind of, until you're at a more senior band in a large tech, kind of big tech company, if you're not able to find something that works, particularly at the federal level, or some of the state and local entities that have invested more in this. So I think it takes a little bit of research to look at the individual organization and role. A point that Nadine had mentioned before about resumes is really relevant here too, that a lot of how pay is determined comes from someone in HR doing an in-depth analysis at the experience of the specific attributes you list in your resume. So you can directly affect where you fall in that rubric based off of having a really thorough, concrete resume. But yeah, the other thing I would just say that, at least for me and a lot of folks that I know who've kind of come in and out of this work, this doesn't have to be a full career shift forever. You can think about it in terms of a year or two and the impact you might have in that time, the experience you might gain in that time. And particularly if you're at a little bit more kind of advanced part in your career where you have flexibility on where you are in salary, you might take a bump down to do the public sector work, but I would be surprised if that doesn't give you some sort of kind of advantage or skill set in your career going forward, if not certainly a meaningful opportunity to do either way. So I think for folks, it's a personal decision, but the transparency and pay definitely is important.
I'm laughing a little bit at your comment about transparency and pay, Dave, because the mining through the classifications to figure out where you, what your job like number might be, and then what the money would be is like a disaster at the city of San Francisco. I don't know if it's different in the federal government, but while there's transparency, it's also very untransparent in how the numbers translate to roles. But that the reason I mentioned that is because at least in the city of San Francisco, and I think it's different in different organizations, our HR department has not modernized enough to be able to really hire tech roles the way that it should. And so what has happened is there's like the kind of shoehorning of technical roles into less technical roles. So the job descriptions are confusingly written, or the HR analysts are counting experience differently from how someone who's hiring for a tech company might count experience. And so that means, like, again, you really have to pay attention to resumes and, you know, like work with people who know what HR is looking for, but it also has implications for salary. So for example, I am technically a business analyst, and because of the history of that role, my PhD does not count towards my salary as experience, which is, I think, ridiculous given that I work in research, but it is how the city works. And so not only is the pay different, but there's just different like norms, and whether or not you think that's fair or not doesn't matter, because that's what HR is going to do. So just for like full transparency, I make half of what I did in the private sector if you count salary and comp and everything like that. And it's exacerbated by things like not counting PhDs. So I do think like there's a real reality in like the pay that you're going to get, and you have to be okay with that either in the short or the long term, like Dave was saying.
Aditya, I know that when we were talking a little about the panel, you also were sharing some of your experience on the emotional and psychological side of the benefits. So I was wondering if you'd weigh in here on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't know about others' experience, but from my perspective, one of the the context is I've been in private techs from seed stage startups to like Series D for the last 8 years of my career, working up to IC senior software engineer level. So working in that kind of an environment that's a little bit fast paced, and it's you know, maybe not all processes are very solidified. You're having to deal with a lot of on-call, a lot of you know, interruptions during your day. I feel like my switch into Civic Tech, like this 3 months, reflecting on the last 3 months of my life, I felt that from a professional standpoint, this is the healthiest I've ever been. Like from a mental health standpoint and from like a physical standpoint, like it's just night and day difference in my career. And that one, I don't think it can be quantified, right? Like it's like I can take a salary cut for that, for like extending like a good healthy quality. And to be quite honest, like one of the biggest reasons that I felt kind of burnt out from the private sector was that my values were not, or what I was working on didn't necessarily align well with the public good. I felt like I had to do a lot of mental gymnastics to convince myself like what I'm doing is actually positive. And over here now on this side of the aisle, I feel like I don't have to do any mental gymnastics. Like what I do directly translates to some state government calling us and telling us, hey, you saved us thousands of hours of work, and that translates to more money for the state. So I think that aspect of it, you know, so much peace of mind. I sleep way better is and all of it. The other part is government does have set hours, or more set hours than the private sector. So on-call disturbance is more minimal. I feel like it's more planned. And even if I do have to go on call, I feel like, you know, it's worth it for whatever we're doing, and I'm able to see that impact.
All right. Well, we have a question that I think is really pertinent, which is from Gregory. Is there a potential track from volunteer to employment? So all three of our panelists have been USDR volunteers at one point. So I'm curious to hear how you all describe it.
I think that's it. For me, at least, volunteering through USDR while working part-time, eventually kind of moving full-time and taking the position when it was available. the state was a reasonable path. We, and at least in the New Jersey organization, we don't have a volunteer kind of capacity directly. We have worked very closely with USDR, brought on probably dozens of folks at this point on various projects, including projects that are very important to us and active currently. So for us, just working through USDR has met that need, but definitely.
Yeah, and maybe I can chime in here as well and just say, we haven't set up there's no formal process where somebody signs up as a volunteer and that then results in a placement, but we've seen, I think over 30 people who have volunteered with USDR have decided to make that transition. And sometimes it's with the organizations that they were volunteering with. That's happened not just in Dave's case, but in a couple other cases. Oh, here's Ellie. She's excited to volunteer with USDR. That's right. Okay. I think for a lot of other folks, it just gives sort of a taste for the work and a sense for what the right kinds of role fits might be.
Yeah, just chiming in on that as well. I think another important thing to name is that those of us who might have been disillusioned with the private sector might have very rosy or ideal understandings or thoughts about what civic tech is. And so I think that's another important thing about volunteering, is that you get a chance to see how the reality of the on-the-ground work matches what you have in your mind, and really being honest with yourself about, is this what I actually want and I can see working? When I was transitioning from academia to industry, a good friend of mine made a comment about how it's much better to just enjoy your day-to-day than be aligned with your values, if being aligned with your values makes you miserable. As a lot of mission-driven work can be, right? It can be exhausting. So I think that's important to keep in mind, and one of the real benefits of USDR. That's why I did it. And then I think the other thing, just piggybacking on what Dave said, I don't know of any volunteer to full-time roles in the city of San Francisco, but I think the real value in places like USDR and volunteering is who you're going to meet and the doors that it's going to open. That was so helpful when I was at USDR, just meeting other like-minded people and seeing the job board.
One other thing to add, so it doesn't have to be a structured volunteer activity. A lot of organizations are working on open source projects, particularly projects on GitHub. And I do know a lot of folks who just even in their free time have contributed meaningfully to those projects as well. So if that's something that you do, open source could be kind of a strategy for getting a little bit more exposure and involvement there as well.
Yeah, huge plus one to the open source aspect of it. Our grants tool is open source, and almost all the other tools that we build here at USDR. So that's a great way for even early career for folks to take a look at this stuff and review some code or contribute in what way they find meaningful, like add documentation. It's a good way to get started.
All right, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. One that's come up a few times is about how much you can share about what you're working on in government. Is that a challenge that some of the work is not public, and does that make it harder to switch jobs later? So love to, certainly for USDR, we are very careful about not sharing anything about our projects that can be identified with our partners unless they've given us permission. But I guess particularly Nadine and Dave, curious to hear how you all have approached this in your careers.
I don't know if the city of San Francisco is an outlier, but I have almost complete freedom to talk about my work. Again, could be very different at the federal level or state level, but this was such a relief for me after coming from Facebook, where, well, I don't think I need to say more about that. It's very difficult to talk about our work externally, especially as researchers, for a variety of reasons. And so that's been, it was really important to me and really freeing. And I think one of the things, again, I've been talking a lot about the maturity of UX and tech work. And so I think this ability to share is really important and something that I'm going to be working on, because we need to have more case studies and transparency about what teams are doing so that we can build up everyone. So that's been one of the real benefits for me. But yeah, I'd be curious to see how it is at other places.
I think there is a level of discretion that goes into the work. For us, at least, the higher kind of the political sensitivity of a project we work on, the more we have to be careful. So, for instance, our head of the Commissioner of Labor at the state of New Jersey is often testifying before the state legislature on the challenges that residents are facing, trying to offer more kind of guidance on what the department is doing to improve that and address some kind of historic systemic issues that have kind of predated this commissioner, but are very much his to worry about now. So, in that work, we're a little more careful, maybe don't contribute quite as much open, not just for any other reason. We don't want things to get distorted and cause a distraction. For other initiatives, like we have an initiative that's basically building a central one-stop resource for businesses to register, license, permit a business as they're getting started all in one place. It's a completely open source project. We talk very openly about it. We kind of will talk with folks in the tech community and press around it to try to build interest for it, just because it's a little less sensitive and more of a kind of greenfield project. So it really depends. If you look at the federal level, 18F, very open, ton of really great resources that they provided through GSA. In some agencies kind of are in the middle, and then as you get maybe closer to the Executive Office of the President, USDS, I think for a lot of reasons there's a lot more kind of discretion that goes into communications. But usually there are people internally who will be available to help you navigate that. And we do try to encourage people at least to celebrate the personal wins around open source contributions, or LinkedIn stories about the things that you were able to do.
All right, we're getting close to the end. And one lightning round question. Aditya, we'll start with you and then go around. What is your favorite part about working in civic tech?
Yeah, I think favorite part is the people. I think that for me, the people has always been the best part of any job or any industry. I think the people over here genuinely mean well, and I think they're trying to do good. And as one of our colleagues said, everyone's a bunch of good eggs. I feel like, and that's a good aspect. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I was trying to think. I think the biggest thing for me has just been working on projects that connect me to the place that I live in a very different. I mean, I know all about the pros and the cons of the government of the city of San Francisco, but as an example, we've been working on a project right now helping street vendors, mostly who are non-English speakers or immigrants to the city, get permits for selling things around public transportation plazas. And that's like I walk by that every day. And it's really cool and interesting to me to be working on a project like that. We've also been doing projects on permitting for parklets, which are like the temporary, permanent structures that support businesses. And I just don't think I was able to have that kind of like immediate connection to a place when I worked at a big tech company. And I guess that's part of the reason I really like working for local government is I get to actually be a part of the thing that I'm like working on and working with.
Yeah, I echo that. And I just go back to the impact and the unique scope of some of the projects. I mean, to rattle off a few. So we talked about the vaccine program, the scale of that, I think was vital. In UI, we just did a fairly simple, simple, it took a lot of work to get to this point, but simple to implement, rewrite of the UI application in New Jersey using more plain language and better tested prompts for the questions, and added in mobile responsive queries to just make a little bit more flexible design. That work alone reduced the application time by about 48 minutes on average, which I think we did the math was like 150,000 hours in the last year saved of New Jerseyans' time applying for UI. So, it's just not many people or places have opportunities like that. So I'm very gracious and appreciative to get to work on those kinds of things. Another one is actually a smaller project, but I really just think about almost every day. During the pandemic, we were able to build a form to help people calculate their income and qualify for eviction protection. The state had a program to protect people who are lower income from being evicted during the pandemic. Eventually, you still have to pay pass-through rent, but you're not going to lose your house during the pandemic. Something like 80,000 people went through that process and were able to get protected, even down to where we heard cases where people in the courts were emailing our team or the division that runs this to get certification from somebody who showed up, hadn't applied, didn't calculate their income correctly, but was able to do it on the fly, like while the case was about to proceed, and save their housing. So stuff like that is just it's humbling and amazing.
Wow, that's incredible. Those stats are amazing. And especially when you think about the people who are in probably so much stress in that moment of filling out that form, like 48 minutes per person is a huge relief. Well, we're almost at time. I want to say thank you to, first of all, everyone in the audience for showing up and being part of this. We're really excited that you're interested in this space. Second, thank you to our panelists for coming and sharing all of your stories, your insights, your wisdom. We wanted to share with everyone just a few things that are coming up that might be useful if you're interested in learning more. First of all, there's a digital services job fair happening tomorrow. We'll put a link in the chat. There are going to be 10 digital services from around the country, local governments. So you can join that and talk to each of them and learn more about those roles. We'll put a couple links in the chat for different public interest job boards, including one from Code for America and Tech Jobs for Good. USDR is also hiring. So we have a couple roles open right now. So we'll put a link to our own job board there. And then finally, we, of course, volunteering is a great way to get a taste for this, as many of the folks on the panel have talked about, and you can really see what it's like. So we'll put a link to do that, as well as a link to sign up for our newsletter if you want to learn more. So once again, thank you. We will follow up with an email with some of these links as well, and a survey. We'd love to get your take on what went well from this panel, what didn't, so that we can continue to improve the Scaling Civic Tech Talk series over time. With that, I just want to say thank you to everyone again, and have a great rest of your day.